Welcome to Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 82. I'm your host, Carrie, and if you're new to our show, we are all about reducing shame, increasing hope, and developing healthier connections with God and others. Today on the show, I'll be talking with Suzanne Burns about creating a trauma-informed ministry. I feel like this is so important for people in the church to understand and know about, and we've had other episodes on about helping people with anxiety in the church, so I'm excited about this episode as well. Suzanne, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am founder and executive director of a maternity home, residential and non-residential program for mothers in crisis. We serve women coming out of jail, out of rehab, pregnant and homeless. Sometimes they've lost custody or are working towards reunification, whether that's with family members or with the state. And so we're part of that process towards getting them to a place of being able to build sustainable stability. And out of what we've learned through doing that for the last 8 years, we've also launched a kind of a side ministry to other churches and nonprofits to help them understand how trauma and poverty mindset and addiction affect the people that they serve so that they can serve more effectively as well.
Awesome. So how did you get started in that work in, mothers in crisis pregnancy situations?
Yeah, I was actually a single mom for a number of years myself. I had a crisis pregnancy when I was in college and then grew up in a very, very Christian home and found myself by the time I was at a junior at a Christian university. I was smoking, I was drinking, I was experimenting with illegal drugs, and then I ended up pregnant. And we did get married. It was not good a marriage as it was a dating relationship, which led to divorce when my son was just right at 2. And then several years of single parenting, met and married. My current husband, we've been married now almost 20 years, had a second son. And as I began to kind of rebuild and restabilize, I wanted to be able to give back to women that were in the same situation that I had once been in. And so I began volunteering at a local pregnancy help center. And I was there for 7 years. Ended up, really, really loving it, loving what I did. But we just began seeing more and more women coming through that needed a deeper level of support. They were pregnant and living in their cars. They were afraid of being kicked out by, angry stepdads. They were 24 and didn't have a GED, kind of floating like a leaf in the wind. So many of these girls. One particular mom that I recall, she came in one day and she was really frustrated because she had been looking for a job. And so I'm kind of a fixer. So I was asking her, maybe are you applying for the wrong kinds of jobs? Are you a poor interviewer? How can I help you fix the problem? And she said, well, at some point in the interview, the baby gets fussy or he needs a diaper change. And, I'm pretty sure the interview is kind of over at that point. And of course, my first thought was, I'm pretty sure the interview was over when they saw you pushing in the baby stroller. But I had been there long enough that I knew that's never the full picture. So as I began asking more questions, I realized that the reason she was taking her child with her in the first place was because she was living with the baby's father, who was a violent drug dealer, and people in and out all day and night. And so she did not trust him to watch their son even long enough for her to get a job. And I went home that day and told my husband, we have got to do something. It has to be us. No one else has stepped up. It has to be us. It took about 2.5 years of fundraising and developing, and we opened in 2014. And that conversation was in June of 2011.
Wow. Tell us about, as you started that ministry and were working in it, some of the challenges that you had earlier on that led you to do some more research about trauma-informed care.
Yeah, pretty much everything I've learned has been because a client came in that we didn't understand or we didn't know how to handle. And that is what sent us then to the research. The Lord is so gracious in giving me a picture and then giving me the education behind it and then bringing others who need me to know that information. So first it was poverty mindset, understanding how chronic poverty kind of reshapes the thinking, the worldview of individuals, especially those living in generational chronic poverty. Then we started getting some clients coming in who had a history of trauma, but we didn't understand what that meant at the time because I was used to seeing clients like 1 hour every 3 weeks. Living with them is a whole lot different. And so we were getting frustrated and we were having a lot of girls come in and go right back out again. We had one girl come in and she was sick constantly. And it was always like an ER worthy trip. She would go in to, about every 3 to 4 weeks. And we began to time it. We began to say, okay, well, it's been, this period of time, we're about due. And it was always like bladder infection, urinary tract infection. It was always something similar, but not exactly the same thing. And it was always validated by the doctors. Because of course we were like, well, at some point she's got to be faking it. And simultaneously with this, she was also losing jobs because of the time off that she was having to take. Her cycle was 6 weeks. And so we were seeing that about every 5 weeks, she was, getting sick, not able to go to work. Her work isn't happy. They end up firing her. She goes to the ER, and then we start the cycle all over again. She ended up that year with 13 different W-2s. And we were so confused. We were so frustrated because she was super, super sweet. And then we had another girl move into the house who used unbelievable amounts of toilet paper just by herself. This was way pre-pandemic, way before there was an actual toilet paper black market. But we were just like, how is this disappearing? How can one person be using this much? What is going on? And then we had a student intern, an MSW, Master's in Social Work intern. And she had us watch a video by Bessel van der Kolk, who is the author of The Body Keeps the Score. And instantly, pieces fell into place. Immediately, we began to realize that this is the physical outgrowth of the trauma that these women had experienced. That was the big awakening, eye-opening. We were immediately addicted to absolutely everything trauma-informed, to the point that we began teaching others just because we knew so much. We just saw the vast needs. There's such an ignorance and such a lack within the church to understand this. It was so fascinating. And it was also such a relief that it can be fixed, that there is reason why, her stomach issues were so constant. There is reason why she was unable to process, to digest the healthy nutritional foods we were giving her. Her body had actually acclimated to Mountain Dew and Cheetos for lunch because that had been for years. So when we're having salads and, fresh fruit and all of that, that was what was abnormal to her system. So for me, layering the poverty mindset with the trauma made it so much easier for us to then deal with women coming in with a past of addiction, those coming in with a history of mental health, because to me, it's just like a layer cake based in the generational chronic poverty thinking that then the trauma is components, it's either affecting or affected by the client. And then that leads to addiction as a coping mechanism, right? It leads to mental health as an epigenetics response to the trauma. It's all interrelated, but it's all rooted in their trauma, but also rooted in poverty thinking. Just from learning all of that, we have radically revolutionized how we work with clients. And we now boast a 97% success rate of our clients being able to maintain their stability at least a year post-graduation, which to us is housing, transportation, employment, and childcare.
Wow, that is really amazing because those are a lot of pieces. And a lot of times what we see is people come into programs and then, they're doing okay. And then they leave the program and they relapse or something happens and they're back into that same cycle again, like you were talking about. We want to talk a little bit about the ACEs study, and I'll have to kind of explain this a little bit to people, and then I have a question for you. So many years ago, I think this was actually done maybe in the 90s or early 2000s.
Late 80s early is when it started, yeah.
Yeah. So Kaiser Permanente, a healthcare company that's out west in the U.S., they said, we really want to look at these people with chronic health conditions. We weren't even talking about mental health. They were talking about physical health, things like high blood pressure, diabetes, and looking at the connection between what they called adverse childhood experiences and these chronic physical health conditions. They had a scale where there's 10 items on the adverse childhood experience scale. Some of them are things like parental divorce, obviously types of abuse, physical, sexual abuse. I think maybe having a parent with an addiction is that on there. These types of experiences that people had in childhood, and what they found was that, okay, if you had one or two, there was maybe a little bit more of a risk for you to have a chronic health condition. But once you got 4 and above, all of a sudden it was like the graph skyrocketed at that point. Like, whoa, for these people to have addictions and actually end up with not just addictions, but that was one of the things they were looking at. Like I said, the high blood pressure and cholesterol and so forth, and looking at people who have had more adverse childhood experiences may even have a shorter lifespan because of some of these chronic health issues that also arise. What you had told me when we had talked previously was like, so the average church attender has 0 to 2 adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're usually called. And the average range for your ministry is 7 to 9. So obviously that's a big gap to bridge in people kind of understanding what some of these women have been through. Like, can you talk to us about like the challenges of bridging that gap?
Yeah, exactly. So many of our clients have the significant trauma history. Someone with an ACE score of 7 to 9 means that they have experienced at least one instance of 7 to 9 of those items on the ACEs study. And just for your audience, they are physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction category is a family member with mental illness, an incarcerated relative, domestic violence, mother treated violently, substance abuse, or divorce, but that also can include fatherlessness. What we found was that these women are coming in and they're carrying this load of trauma. They're carrying the past pain. They're carrying the physical effects of this. They're carrying the social and emotional and cognitive impairment because of that. Many of our moms, about 70%, did not graduate with a high school diploma or GED because all of this trauma is happening as children. And so that is significantly affecting them as far as school goes. Then you get labeled a bad kid. And so then you begin adopting those risky health behaviors, whether it's teen boys that are driving too fast, whether it's dating the wrong kinds, whether it's, drugs and alcohol and all of these different things that then lead to disease and disability, social problems, in and out of jail, in and out of rehab programs, which can then lead to early death. It can also lead to chronic heart disease, to certain forms of cancer, to COPD, and so many different things that we don't even associate usually for an 18 to 22-year-old. The ACEs study does demonstrate that. So we have women coming in from the church who want to volunteer, in this world that have experienced, like me, the ACE questionnaire asks you from birth to age 18. That to answer that, I was a 0. All of my ACEs occurred during this one single relationship. And I went from a 0 to a 7 and then kind of back down again once I began to get my life back together. I have a certain degree of experience, but I cannot relate to the majority of our clients in the fullness of what they've experienced. And so these little volunteers from the churches would want to come in. I experienced this when I was young. I did that. And so they think that that is enough to balance out the relationship. It really isn't, because they can't understand the depth of the brain changes that have occurred. So one of the most important things for us when we're talking with new prospective volunteers is to really get them to understand what has changed in the brain development of our typical client. They think differently. They respond differently. They have been conditioned to think in these certain ways. And so their behavioral patterns, it takes a long time to change those things. So you're going to see more rapid outbursts of anger. You're going to hear foul language as just as common. You're going to see and hear things that you're not going to expect in a typical ministry. And you don't necessarily have permission to address it. That's usually the hardest part because, they haven't built the trust with our clients. Many of our volunteers want to come in and they want to do Bible studies. Well, many of our girls just flat aren't interested, first of all. And second of all, even if they are interested, they're not ready for that level. There's a great deal of biblical illiteracy, but there's also a lot of church hurt and church abuse that has to be gotten over before they're ready for these types of things. And so many times they want to come in, and volunteers from the church want to come in and do these big, deep Bible studies with the girls that impacted them. But they're not a good fit for our clients because maybe they can't read that well. Maybe they're not equipped to do the amount of homework that is associated with some of these types of programs. Maybe they're not ready emotionally for what is going to be unveiled. Maybe they're not ready as far as just being able to read scripture specifically. Some of those Old Testament names are really complicated. And especially if you accidentally ask one of them to read out loud because you're wanting to draw them in, you're doing the things that in a typical church environment you want to do, it can backfire. And so we have to be really, really careful to equip our volunteers wisely so that they're not set up for failure, because our mission is not our volunteers. Our mission is our clients. And so our volunteers cannot run off our clients, but there have been several times where our clients run off volunteers.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Yeah.
If you haven't been used to that experience of what those people have been through in terms of the emotional reactivity that can happen with PTSD over something that to you seems very slight, but it was a huge deal for that individual. It was a huge trigger. And I think, one of the things that you're touching on is a lot of times what the church can be guilty of is in these types of ministries going in and trying to clean people up. Here, let me help you, here's some money, or here's a job, or here's some clothes. And, we're just going to fix you all up and everything's going to be good, when really true transformation has to happen from the inside out. I'm curious in terms of what you've seen regarding that, maybe in your work with other ministries, kind of how you've helped them to reframe that.
Exactly. So it's twofold. One is the focus internally and how you work with clients. And the other one is how you message that to the greater community, to your donor base or to your volunteer pool, like your occasional volunteer pool. A lot of times I'll use the analogy of a pound, because sometimes if you can change the picture from people to animals, it's a little bit easier to process. Not that I'm equating our clients with animals, but sometimes it's just an easier word picture to process. You find a stray dog on the side of the road, and he's dirty and matted and filthy, and you got all sorts of insects and everything crawling all over him. He's just really unhappy, starving. And you pick him up and you take him to the pound. They're going to do a lot of work. They're going to be checking him out by a doctor. They're going to be cleaning him and defleeing and debugging him, whatever's crawling on him. They're going to be getting him the nutrition that he needs. That's a process. It's not an instantaneous, I found a dog on the side of the road and now he's ready for adoption into a new home. They have to see what's his temperament, what kind of personality is he? Does he get along well with other animals? Does he get along with small children? Before they can put this animal into the adoptable population, they have to do some rehab work. But when we look at people on the side of the road, it's like we have the expectation that all you need is a shower, a hot meal, and a change of clothes, maybe a haircut. But you ought to be fine now and go get you a job, start paying your own way. And it's not at all the same. The women that we work with are so broken, and they have been holding themselves together for so long that a lot of times our first few months is just giving them space to finally acknowledge their brokenness and finally feel all the feelings that they have been hiding from for so long, before we can even begin the process of rehabilitation to get them to the place where they can then learn, then grow and move forward. Our motto is rescuing mothers, rebuilding lives, and restoring futures. And that is very much the progression that we walk through with these women. Rescuing can take upwards of 6 months. Rebuilding, that's the point where she's finally ready to start working and getting the job skills that she needs and figuring out, credit and starting to save money to buy her first vehicle, because we live in a semi-rural area where there is not public transportation. And so a car is almost always her first goal. And then getting daycare and getting healthy, getting her into the OBGYN office and checking her out, making sure the baby is doing well. And then as she begins to kind of master some of these things and start looking towards the future, now we can start thinking about, well, what does rebuilding look like for her? What does living independently look like for her? And that whole process overall, pre-pandemic, we were looking at 6 months to a year for most clients. And since that time, it really is more like 18 months to 2 years, partly because of economic changes and partly because we're seeing a significant increase in the severity of the women that come to us. And just for a frame of reference, we're the only maternity home within 150 miles. We serve 13 counties by design and several others by default. So it's a really vast population that many are in this boat, but they are not being served because we are so limited on staff and size.
Yeah, where are you located at?
Right outside Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Okay, great. Tell us about BeCharityWise.
Yeah, that is our training arm. We have online videos and we also do in-person, whether live via Zoom or local trainings to help other churches, nonprofits understand how trauma and poverty mindset and addiction affect the people that they serve so that you can serve more effectively. If people are interested in going to BeCharityWise.com, I've written a short little book called The Accidental Social Worker that helps you get a feel for the why behind some of these things, why poverty mindset is an issue, why trauma is affecting physically. Many times we just assume that, okay, well, you're not in trauma anymore. I've rescued you out of that. I've got you a safe bed to sleep in. I've gotten you food. That should be enough. But the trauma carries with them because the trauma is not actually the event that happened. It's the emotions associated with the event that happened. And that can carry through really for a lifetime until these women are able to find healing.
Yeah, that's huge. And a lot of overlays between what you're talking about and foster care, this sense of like, okay, so we've removed this child from the home where there was addiction and poverty and neglect. And now we've put them in the suburbs with this nice family and everything's safe and good, but they're still responding as though they're in that abuse, neglect environment. That happens quite frequently. And a lot of times they're very confused by that. Like, what in the world is going on? Why didn't responding this way? Yeah, exactly. I think that what you're doing is so important in terms of us being able to effectively minister to people out in the community, like the real world, real life stuff that you're seeing. And so I appreciate you sharing with us about that. At the end of every podcast, I like to ask our guests to share a story of hope, which is a time in which you received hope from God or another person.
The one that sparks me is actually what got me out of my first marriage and on this long journey, even though at the time I really didn't realize it. I was still in active addiction with my first husband, but I was managing it. He was a musician, which meant he didn't have to work, apparently. So I was doing what I could to earn more. Like I had sold mortgages. At this time, I was selling insurance. And I had a really frustrating day. And I went to go to my mother-in-law's to pick up our son. And I was just kind of complaining. These were good little church people as well. And so I was still talking the talk when I was around them. And I just said, it was so frustrating. I don't understand why God just won't bless me. My mother-in-law just very graciously turned around and said, well, honey, what are you doing that God can bless? And then she just went back to filling my son's little backpack as we got ready to go home. But in an instant, I was just stripped naked. I was so raw and open and vulnerable. I finally saw myself through the Lord's eyes. And that was the day that I had to shift everything. That was November of 2000. And from that point forward, it took several weeks for me to quit smoking. But that was the only thing I was really personally addicted to. But the cigarettes, the alcohol, and the drugs just stopped immediately. My marriage was more of a challenge, but by February, my son and I were living independently because I couldn't stay any longer. The veil had been removed and I couldn't unsee it. And I knew that if I stayed in my first marriage, because my first husband was not willing to leave that lifestyle, I knew that I would not be strong enough to stay stable on my own. It was either with him and clean or without him and clean. And he chose without. So that to me is one of the defining conversations of my life. And it was probably 15 seconds long.
Yeah. Sometimes all you need is that like kind of one or two sentences and it just sparks something within you. That was a huge, sounds like a turning point. It changed the whole like trajectory of your life there. Wow.
It sure did. Yeah.
Wow. We'll put links in the show notes to where people can find you, and hopefully some people will kind of take advantage of these trainings for their churches and ministry sites.
Yeah, I would love that.
I was so excited to do this episode because I believe that trauma-informed ministry is such an important topic. Steve and I recently went to some foster care RAP training at our church, which is for supporting foster families, such as, doing laundry for them, taking them food, possibly providing respite childcare, those types of things. And they talked about trauma, the impact of trauma a little bit, and understanding that foster children are going to respond differently than other children might. A couple podcast updates for our regular listeners as we head towards the end of the year. In a couple weeks, we will have Thanksgiving in America, and this is a great time to celebrate what we are thankful for. So I will be putting out a special episode on gratitude and Thanksgiving. I usually skip Thanksgiving and Christmas weeks on the podcast, but I decided to shuffle things around just a little bit this year. Our first episode in December is actually going to be our only episode because I'm going to take the next few weeks of the year off. But that's a really great episode in December on how to set boundaries. So it's kind of our Boundaries 202 conversation. We had our Boundaries 101 conversation. What is a boundary? Why are they important? And then right before you spend time with relatives around Christmas, we're going to be talking about how do I set a boundary. Hopefully going to be so helpful for some of you as you navigate difficult family situations. There are a couple things on my heart as we get ready to go into the new year. One is that I get a request about once a week from someone out of state looking for therapy from a Christian for OCD. So I'm realizing what a big need that is, and also what a huge challenge people are having with finding providers that are versed in OCD or that they feel comfortable in terms of sharing their Christianity with. I think I may do an episode at some point or another on seeking secular counseling and some specific things that you may want to look for or be aware of or so forth. If you choose to go that route, I know not everybody wants to do that, but it may be a possibility in some cases. If you aren't able to find a Christian provider, you may be able to find someone who respects your faith. Now, along some of those same lines, I would like to set up some type of resource list because people are asking me, do you know anyone in this state? Do you know anyone in that state? And while I do know quite a few counselors, unfortunately, most of them are located in Tennessee. So with that being said, if you have a really great therapist that you would recommend to someone else, please definitely send them my way. You can send me an email message basically by filling out the contact form on our website at bythewellcounseling.com. If you scroll down to the very bottom, you will see our contact form in there and just say, hey, I have this great counselor. They're seeing me for OCD. This is what I like about them. I am specifically looking for OCD providers because I feel like it's a lot easier to find someone who is versed in treating anxiety, as that is a lot more common. So if you will send me your recommendations, Christians, providers you've worked with that respected your faith, people that you felt really comfortable with, and just what you liked about them, I think is important as well. What kind of treatment modality they were using with you, whether it was ERP or another modality, that's helpful for us to just know as well as we're recommending people. Sometimes the best way to find a counselor can be a personal recommendation. So we would love to pass your recommendation off to someone else and at least be able to say, hey, this person had a good experience. And then we can kind of keep a running list so that I feel like I have some people that would like to be able to refer out to in other states as well. You're certainly welcome to travel for an intensive, although I know that can be time consuming and travel costs and so forth are piled on top of that. Thank you all so much for listening.
Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling. Our show is hosted by me, Carrie Bach, licensed professional counselor in Tennessee. Opinions given by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself or By the Well Counseling. Our original music is by Brandon Mangroom. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.